Hey neighbor, welcome back to Tears on Tuesday. My name is John, and this is a year-end edition of the show, so I'm gonna cut through the noise, flip the script, and reveal my most disappointing albums of 2022. This year saw the album format continue to struggle as the playlistification of this new era continues its invasion, while some of the most hyped comebacks fell way short of expectations. But it wasn't just the longtime veterans letting us down. I noticed a trend among massively popular artists where it felt like they either played it very safe or else left us scratching our heads wondering how the hell this sharp drop in quality happened. From the Yeah Yeah Yeahs to Polyphia to the Weeknd and Harry Styles, I'll take each album, give some thoughts, plug it into the tier list, and give a rating. Joji's latest album, Smithereens, doesn't even touch 25 minutes in length, leaving me to wonder, can I even really call this an album? I never would have predicted this direction based on the really strong ballad that was put out as the lead single, a top 10 Billboard hit, Glimpse of Us, but honestly, at the end of the day, outside of some really good cuts like Die For You, Glimpse of Us, and also the track Night Rider that really takes off in its second half, I feel like this album just doesn't feel like him living up to his best potential. Joji is normally very good at bringing the vibes, but this album just felt very inconsistent with a lot of speed bumps, and I'm gonna have to put this in the noticeable downgrade category, although painfully average would probably work too. After a 9-year gap between albums, Karen O and company are finally back as the Yeah Yeah Yeahs with a total of 1 track per year apparently, because 9 years away, a 9-song, 32-minute album. Cool It Down did exactly what its title implies, as it cooled me throughout the runtime. I think there's 3 extremely strong tracks here, maybe not all-timers, but still, Burning, spitting off the edge of the world with Perfume Genius, and also the track Wolf with a big danceable break that reminds me of their awesome 2009 album It's Blitz. But outside of those cuts, I can't say that the deep cuts have anything to offer all that much in the way of interesting material because there's so much repetition, there's a lot of stuff from Karen O that I feel that we've heard before, and there's a noticeable lack of Nick Zinner on guitar on this record. I don't think this is a very good album at all, not to say that it's necessarily as rough as Mosquito, but I still didn't get much from it. It's kind of a slog to get through even though it's only 32 minutes. And I'm putting this one in the okay, it's kinda bad. You guys are probably gonna give me hell for this one, but hear me out. I think the latest Ghost album, Impera, especially with repeated listens, is really lacking. Their form of worship almost feels like they're just going through the motions. And while great tracks like Kassarian and Spillways really do ignite something in me, and the guitars on this record generally sound pretty great, I don't feel that the lyricism or the general concept of the album and the poppier tendencies really paid off all that well. Redundancy is looming, and I'm really hoping that the next project sees them shake off the rust a little bit because this one is pretty painfully average. Mitski's reach almost felt like it was on an evangelical level with the amount of indie kids that she was reaching on Be the Cowboy after that came out in 2018. It's a fascinating record that's brimming with confidence, but after that, she quickly became jaded with the music industry, hence why we're getting an album that's a contractual obligation rather than a want. You can really feel the conflicted nature of the track list. There's only 11 songs, about 35 minutes, and she worked on this album for years, but it didn't materialize in a very natural way, which made this a very arduous process that's now felt. I was kind of shocked at the lack of potency that Laurel has, and also the songwriting, the production, it just doesn't really sink its teeth in. In fact, it flies right over the head or under the radar. I was a little bit shocked at how uninspired the 80s influence comes across, because while it makes great appearances on tracks like The Only Heartbreaker and even moments of Heat Lightning that unfortunately didn't stick with me as much as I thought it would, there's tracks like That's Our Lamp that close out the album that get it right, but others in between that feel extremely forgettable and clumsy. I wouldn't say that Mitski and Painfully Average generally go hand in hand, but for Laurel Hell, it's unfortunately a fitting title. The Arctic Monkeys are never gonna be the rock and roll band that they used to be. In fact, after Tranquility Base Hotel and Casino marked a sharp left turn sonically, they doubled down on that with the release of The Car in all of the most unfortunate ways. Up to this point, I didn't think they had a bad or even mediocre album, but Alex Turner gets inside of his own head a little bit too much for this project's own good. Tranquility Base was so much more captivating thematically, even the musical arrangements just actually felt like there was some life and some satire packed in, but The Car feels a bit drab and colorless effortless like the album cover. It starts off amazing with some incredible tracks like There'd Better Be a Mirror Ball, Body Paint is another fantastic one, Sculptures of Anything Goes, and the title track, The Car Itself. But overall, I'm feeling like this is a noticeable downgrade. After Hours Till Dawn. That's the way that these two albums were tied together by the Weeknd himself and by his promo campaigns surrounding it. We had After Hours, one of the best albums of 2020 in my eyes, but also in 2022, we got the Jim Carrey narrated counterpart Dawn FM just totally fumbling. No, of course I don't think this is unlistenable. I just think Abel Tesfaye is capable of so much more. Dawn FM is definitely a well-produced album, and it sounds pretty solid, especially in headphones, but I just find myself zoning out. I don't feel like he's able to sink the hooks in the same way. There's engrossing cuts from Gasoline that really do get my attention, and some of the other more tender, heartfelt moments or more abrasive natures that actually go out in left field, but I feel like The Weeknd spends much of the runtime just really playing out his fantasy of being a spaceman. I don't have a body full of bad blood boiling to a breaking point over here, but Dawn FM is still a noticeable downgrade that didn't get even half of the things right that After Hours did effortlessly. New Zealand indie pop alternative sibling duo BROODS had a tough time following up their excellent 2019 album Don't Feed the Pop Monster. Not to say that Space Island is an unwarranted, unjustified release, it's just a bit of a pandemic album that feels a little bit too late. Bops like Piece of My Mind, Distance and Drugs, and even the closing track If You Fall in Love really have an emotive persuasion that's up there with the best that BROODS have to offer, but there's a fading sweetness, kinda like chewing on a piece of gum that doesn't have a ton of flavor the more time you spend with Space Island. Georgia really does stand out as a vocalist here, but I can't help but feel like Caleb was lacking a bit in what he brought to the instrumentals. I think the album does have some really catchy highs, but those lows, those are the zone out moments that just have me feeling like shrugging my shoulders like nothing really happened. Still, at the end of the day, the sibling duo can't help but be at least a little bit good at their craft, and I'm gonna have to say that this album's not so bad. Remember That You Will Die is my first full album experience with Polyphia after falling in love with a slew of singles from Goose to Goat and all of the other animals. 37 minutes, 12 tracks, Remembering That I'm Dying, it sounds like a fantastic game plan, and while the dudes in Polyphia are obviously technically marvelous as always, it's a bit like watching a James Cameron film where maybe the heart and soul aren't exactly there as much as you'd want them to be, even though it sounds and looks very immersive. They did collaborate with other artists more on this record, whether that be rappers or singers, and that did feel slightly jarring. There's some that do pay off, and I don't necessarily think those are maybe the ones like the single ABC that got a lot of attention, or even the closing track with Steve Vai. I just wasn't blown away by that. Like I said, this is my first full album experience, so I did walk away feeling like I wanted a lot more. There's some great cuts on there. Bloodbath with Chino from Deftones, fantastic. Playing God, so good, but outside of some of those really big highs, I just feel like this album is a noticeable downgrade from what they do best. Panic at the Disco's Viva Las Vengeance came after a few tumultuous years in which a couple of people departed from the touring band and Brendan Urie came under fire, and it seemed like a lot of people were judging this latest album based on their opinion of him rather than the music itself. But to me, this album actually did contain some really good strengths, and I like to see Brendan Urie with a more rock-oriented sound. It's just that I've come back to this album a whopping total of 0 times since it came out. Why am I not coming back to this album? Well, I feel that so many of the hooks are underwritten, serviceable, I guess, and fine sometimes in the moment. It's just that they can feel like they're lacking that major spark that's supposed to start the fire, so as a result, we don't really get many songs outside of maybe the title track that actually feel like they're worth keeping around. The production somehow feels a bit rushed, and I hate to say it, but I feel like the writing needs a major facelift. And for this album, even though it is taking those influences from the 60s and the 70s, it's wearing them a bit too much on its sleeve. And if Brendan's gonna keep this thing rolling along, then I think the hype train needs a totally different type of steam. Painfully average, totally okay, inoffensive enough, Panic at the Disco's Viva Las Vengeance will more than likely quickly be forgotten. Going viral on social media can have its perks for sure, but it can also come with a major drawback, and I think Steve Lacy is the breakout artist that felt that the most in 2022. Steve Lacy has put in the work, and he absolutely deserves his spotlight. I just wish that the project had turned out better, because while there's great tracks on there, I really enjoy Helmet, Buttons. The immature writing really does start to become quite noticeable, distracting, and with the production not necessarily offering anything all that interesting, even compared to some of his past hits like Dark Red, I felt like this album started to fall on its face. I picked off and saved some of the highlights, but for the amount of hype that I have seen about this album, it's pretty painfully average. Rina Sawayama's genre-bending debut album Sawayama became one of my favorite albums of 2020 because it did so many things very, very well. But 2 years later, we're fast forwarding, and it feels like the teacher picked up the homework before the assignment was completed because this album, Hold the Girl, feels like a sophomore slump. Nobody wants to hear me use that word, I know, but trust me, this absolutely shatters my heart to pieces because I wanted to love this album so much. What happened to the idea of not knowing what road we were gonna go down, of there being some weird experiment that could be coming next, and a stylistic shift that actually made sense? This album has some of those things, but it does none of them as well as she did the first time. This Hell, Frankenstein, Holy Till You Let Me Go, there are moments that are pretty easy to grapple onto and see why she was quickly becoming the superstar that she now is, or was, or kinda is. I hate to say it, but outside of a few choice cuts, it feels like this album was not written by Rina Sawayama. It feels kinda like a rush job, and I have to say, it's kinda bad. There weren't just growing whispers about Bad Omens, there was so much hype that it became a full-on roar. The singles were slowly being sent into my streams, and I was reacting to them live, and I ended up hearing 3, Artificial Suicide, Like a Villain, and the title track, The Death of Peace of Mind. Out of those 3, I kinda fell for all of them in different ways, especially Artificial Suicide, and I knew that I was gonna have to check out the album because of my excitement for those. But once I got there, I felt that initial disappointment, and I felt my excitement fading away because much of the runtime, it is a bit bloated. It's around 53 minutes, and it just doesn't need to be that long, despite the fact that it opens and closes on very strong sections. The menacing screams in this record are offset by a nice clean vocal, and I really like the fact that they can go into that poppier territory like other bands like Dayseeker do pretty well, but the difference with Bad Omens is that they can crank it within the same song and actually make it feel pretty natural. Bad Omens don't always disguise their influences all that well, which can be a little unflattering if I'm hearing too much in the way of, say, Bring Me the Horizon, or if they're going industrial, then maybe 9 Inch Nails. Even though that middle section doesn't offer much excitement or nuance, I still think this album has a lot of big highs, a lot of fantastic guitar work. I like the vocals. The production generally sounds pretty good, although I think they could use somebody a little bit more rough around the edges, but I'm gonna have to say this album is not so bad. I really didn't see myself getting here by the end of the year, but fortunately I did, because we're talking about the Canadian punks Pup in the Unraveling of PUPTHEBAND. Fresh out of ideas and right out of a pandemic, Pup Incorporated don't really know what to do with themselves. And for a while, I didn't know how I felt about the concept of the album, like Pup are thinking of themselves as a business, which they are, and they don't really know how to expand. It's interesting because I think some of the expansion plans are kind of fun to see in real time, despite the fact that it can be distracting when they cram them into the little interludes and skits. That kind of tanks the pacing, at least in places, but I love that they come in guns blazing on cuts like Matilda, Robot Writes a Love Song, and some other tracks towards the end of this album that kind of blew me away the more that I actually sat and paid attention. At the same time, this can be a really frustrating album because I know they're capable of more, and it seems like they kind of stifle themselves creatively in the name of comedy or self-roasting or loathing, and it pays off occasionally, other times it doesn't. It's kind of a messy release, but at the same time, there's a lot of charm here. It's nowhere close to the level of Morbid Stuff, which was my album of the year 2019, but I still am gonna say this album's not that bad at all. Harry Styles put out Harry's House as his third album, and for some reason this is his most successful to date, despite it easily being his worst to date. Okay, worst gives it really bad implications. It's his worst to date. It doesn't mean that it's awful, but it's just really tepid. The soft rock vibes on this thing, it didn't really cut it for me. Certain elements of this album, like production, songwriting, even some of the vocal samples that are chopped up in the background, they feel a bit careless, and that's not something that I've seen as par for the course up to this point in his solo discography. Despite having something as amazing as the graceful wave of emotion that is Matilda, this album is full of some rather awkward performances on the likes of Cinema, Little Freak, and other cuts that just feel like they're trying to be more sexual and overt in the way that they carry themselves, but they feel like they've dumbed down the instrumentation along with the way that Harry approaches the lyrics. Harry's House is painfully average any way you frame it, and feels shallow by comparison. Beach Bunny unfortunately stagnated a bit on their latest LP, Emotional Creature. It's led by a charge of emotion that we've seen before, but to a much more infectious degree on the cuts like Sports and Cloud 9 and Dream Boy that really put Beach Bunny on the map. The singles did their job by getting me excited for this album. I thought Oxygen was so well written and just a fun song to bask in, and then you've got other cuts like Fire Escape that just have a really catchy guitar lick. I was excited to see how they would explore and evolve their sound. Sadly, we don't really get to see much in the way of growth on this album. It feels stunted in many ways, with lazy relationship lyrics and other tropes that have been explored to death in their own catalog and their peers surrounding them. But the kind of surfy sound, beach adjacent if you will, it's alternative pop with a certain kind of sweetness that never sounds awful, it's just that you want it to be more. I know that Beach Bunny are incredibly talented. I love what Lily is doing vocally on much of the album, although there are songs where it feels like she's kind of covering the same ground, but all in all, this just feels like it's a noticeable downgrade, but not one that I don't want to listen to, because tracks like Scream, they show me exactly what this band should do in the future. Turnover really seemed to be getting their Pink Floyd on, because on this latest album, Myself in the Way, I don't even know what the fuck they're doing, and part of my brain says that's a great thing, but the other part says, yeah, but they're going a little bit too far, okay? I wouldn't say somebody spiked the punch bowl this time, but this album, Myself in the Way, does bring some more creative strides to the table. Not all of them work, and not all of them sound that great, but I have to at least give them kudos for trying. The guys in Turnover seem very uninterested in really promoting the album, which is why I haven't seen much hype for it at all. That, along with the change in sound that includes some really excessive auto-tune and some hard to decipher lyrics, I suppose, and a few wasted guest spots like Turnstile's Brendan Yates. Most of the 12 songs here run on for more than 4 or 5 minutes, which is undoubtedly too long. You really do start to feel the 46-minute runtime by the time you're like halfway through, after I would say Ain't Love Heavy, because I love the experimentation there. Overall, unfortunately, this album is pretty dreary, and I would say it's a noticeable downgrade. I was having trouble getting into the spirit of the new Carly Rae Jepsen era, and I don't know why that is, because Dedicated Side B, and some of the material that was coming around that time, I felt it was solid, maybe not her strongest, but parts of my brain are still just so addicted to Emotion and Emotion Side B that I want to run back there. Now it's been 10 years since Call Me Maybe in 2022 brought about the loneliest time to see her trekking forward yet again with 80s sounds in tow, but this time with a bit more of a negative outlook along with her regular Jubilee. I really didn't feel that the singles trickling out from the loneliest time were winning me over all that much, especially Beach House. A lot of people were shocked to see that in my dishonorable mentions for worst songs of the year, but that one just feels out of pocket for an aging, more mature Carly. Not to say that she doesn't have tons of fun still in her music, this album has plenty of that, but I also feel that just underwriting to that degree, even if it's meant to be sarcastic, it's just not really a fun time. Western Wind also floated in on a different plane of existence because this is definitely a bit of a momentum shift for Carly Rae, but she sounds good enough. I just don't know if it offers a ton in its runtime. I think I appreciate the sonic direction, but it wasn't fully fleshed out. But I was still determined to give this album a chance, and I'm glad that I did, because within 3 or 4 listens, I started warming up to it. And now at this point, I definitely put this in the it's not bad at all. Guys, I of course did not hear every album this year, nor did I want to. I cut way back on the amount of new releases that I heard. Unfortunately, a high amount of them just happened to be rather disappointing to my ears, so even if you disagree, hit that like button, let me know what you thought of my list and what albums disappointed you the most. Other than that, you can check out my year-end content floating on screen now, and I will see you soon for more on ARTV.